My blood oxygen is below 50, unsure what to do. I am not the OOP. OOP is you, chewy boot. My blood oxygen is below 50. Unsure what to do. Originally posted to R. Kilimanjaro and R. Mountaineering. Thanks to you, Soe Herder, for suggesting this BORU. Trigger warning. Near-death experience. Life-threatening medical emergency. Less than. Mood spoiler. No permanent damage. Reddit being Reddit. Less than. Fleece recommendations available in Australia? June 2nd, 2023. I'm climbing Keeley in 2 weeks and have yet to settle on a fleece. Coming from Australia, I have no frame of reference for how cold it gets. So would love some recommendations on brands and models to trust. How many porters does a trip operator normally provide? June 13th, 2023. My tour operator just told me that my solo private tour will include a guide, a cook, and six porters. This seems like way too many for a one-person tour, even including all the equipment for the group. Is this normal? My blood oxygen is below 50. Unsure what to do. June 24th, 2023. Recent trek turned nightmare. Stopped breathing and rushed down to lower level where reading was 49%. I'm terrified and have no idea what to do. Currently trying to contact a medical helicopter. Relevant comments. Front if the wagon. And you decided to post this on Reddit as it's happening. Great coverage. Who's your provider, as I may need to switch? FideiUX. If you are conscious and typing, you are going to be fine. If a meter is telling you 49%, it is broken. Zekioak. If you can post on Reddit, it's a good sign. Blood oxygen level ain't as important as other symptoms. Headache? Ataxia? Throwing up? Short breathing even after resting? What to do? Continue going down. Winkja. Honestly, posting on Reddit doesn't imply that his brain is getting enough oxygen. Most people can post fine without it. ELIPGY5. Could have hate. 49% is low. But we saw some very low SATs during COVID with people still on their phones. Keeley is actually quite an easy place to get hace. Altitude gain can be very rapid. Equally, it's quite an easy place to get down from. Not technical. So op. Go down. Keep going down. Find a doctor. Check your SpO2 on a second oximeter when you can. For those saying it's a panic attack, no. Look at the OBS. Sure, the low SpO2 might be wrong, but it would be silly to assume that. OP is hypoxic until proven otherwise. And HAPE or PE are the likely causes. Update to my blood oxygen is below 50 inches post June 25th, 2023. Long-winded update for anyone who cares. My experience failing to summit Kilimanjaro. As a bit of background, yesterday was the end of my adventures on Mount Kilimanjaro. Unfortunately, on the summit attempt, I ran into a brutal bout of altitude sickness and came short of the summit with less than an hour of hiking left. Thankfully, I managed to get out without serious damage due to the incredible guides. Like most hikers, I started for the summit from Barafu Camp, 4,600 meters. At around midnight, from the get-go, I'm realizing something's not quite right with my fitness. I'm wheezing just from doing light walking at camp, and have a splitting headache and nausea that won't go away. Anyway, we start the climb and around 5,200 I'm noticing I'm getting seriously winded. And my headache has evolved from uncomfortable to, why is there a tire iron in my eye, painful. I try to trudge though, but meters from Stella Point, 5,700 meters, my body just shuts down. I've been gasping for air for the last half hour, but suddenly I just can't fill my lungs at all. My legs turn to jelly beneath me. The headache turns blinding and I just collapse. Desperate for air, my guide tries to help me up, but I may puddle at this point and just keep gasping at him for oxygen. I genuinely thought I was going to die. I couldn't get a breath in. We managed to find a tank from Stella Point, and it gives me a brief 5 minutes of relief that lets me regain my legs. My guide sprint drags me down the mountain to a lower point. There we do the blood oxygen reading and it hits 49%. This same pulse oximeter has been giving me 8,590% consistently during the daily check-ins for the last week, apart from a 76% after an acclimatization hike where we hit 4,600 before descending to below 4,000. So I tend to trust it and get intensely freaked out at the 49%. My guide calls a medical chopper, which never ends up arriving, and I try to use a cell signal to find out information on what I can do as a means to stop the impacts of low blood ox, or at least calibrate my anxiety level appropriately. Being Tanzania's 3G internet, none of the pages load on my phone, but Reddit started up perfectly. So I decided to turn to this community for advice, emotional support. I of course got only detailed, compassionate responses. That reminded me that asking medical advice from strangers is a very sensible thing to do. No, seriously. Thank you to everyone who provided advice. It helped me get the help I needed once I got to the hospital. Anyway, after waiting an hour for a chopper that never came, we ended up hiking for 4 hours to get to a road, and managed to get back to Moshi where my breathing returned to normal after a few hours. Still a bit crook, but no signs of permanent damage. So while there may have been a misread with my blood oxygen as a lot of people thought, I truly was in a bad state, and the oximeter my guide used was the same exact model the hospital used. I don't know if I was truly below 50%, but I've never felt worse in my life. So for anyone traveling to Kilimanjaro, enjoy a wonderful experience. But as I learned, you can't tough out altitude sickness. If you're getting the signs, turn back before your body shuts down. Also, the 2 things you should never rely on in an emergency: emergency services in Tanzania and Reddit. TLDR. Got slammed with altitude sickness on Kili. Asked for help on Reddit and was fairly mocked for using it as emergency help, but managed to get down safely. Relevant comments. ELIPGY5. Hey mate, MD guy here who posted on the last thread. Glad to hear you pulled through okay. Altitude sickness sucks. And Kili is a pretty easy place to get it because it's like a giant ramp straight up to the sky. Sorry that so many people here decided to mock you in the middle of a medical emergency. I thought a lot of the posts were unfortunate. Cheers. Oop. Cheers mate. I really appreciated your comment on the last post when you're sick in a foreign place. Decent advice like yours feels fantastic. Fideux. Thanks for the update. I was one of the slightly skeptical, but trying to be helpful posters. I'm very glad you are back safe. That makes the trip a success no matter what anyone says. Thanks for posting more about your situation. Hard to put yourself out there, but it will help others learn, and that is why we are here. Good luck to you, and I hope this doesn't keep you out of the mountains forever. There is a whole world to explore in your backyard, and you can now do so from the position of someone who has been there and seen how tough and complex it can get. This is a repost sub IAM, not the OOP. Being Tanzania's 3G internet, none of the pages load on my phone, but Reddit started up perfectly. The most important part of this. Even without him saying so, OOP's awesomeness shines through that whole saga. I met my wife when we were teaching EFL abroad in a coastal region. Followed her home to Colorado to meet her family, and not eastern flat as Kansas, Colorado. They lived in the foothills of some big-ass mountains. Now, I was used to lower altitudes, But she knew about altitude sickness and realized there'd be some adjustment after we'd been living at sea level for 3 years. So, our first week in her hometown, while we're still in a hotel looking for apartments and jobs, she insists on going for just a short walk around the block. I was confused, as this hotel didn't seem to be in the fanciest part of town. But she could be showing me around. What she showed me was how vital it is to adjust to high altitudes. It was a humbling experience to be left gasping like a fish after a 2-minute walk. Wisely, my wife-to-be kept me going on these walks until my lungs learned to find what little oxygen there was in that air. A year later, we had gotten married and were camping in the Rockies regularly. Glad Oop got through it okay. Altitude sickness can wreck you. Oof. I was born and raised at sea level and I am unfortunately very prone to altitude sickness. I can only imagine how terrible and terrifying this felt, as even mild altitude sickness is pretty debilitating. I did Keeley 10 years ago because my boss thought it was a great team building exercise. I was okay until summit night. As soon as we hit 5,000 meters, I started throwing up constantly. Ended up extremely dehydrated by the time I got to Gilman's Point. And I refused to continue the summit attempt. At least the next team building event was a Christmas party which was marginally safer. I was at the same O2 percentage. 60s dropping to 48 for the last couple days. During a 9-day trek to EBC. A little lower than Keeley. Also had food poisoning halfway up, so all I could eat was plain potatoes, plain pasta, and oddly enough Snickers. So that's what I lived on for the last 4 days of the trek. Each day was a death march for me till lunch. Eat, put my head down till it was time to go, then repeat until dinner, then right to bed. But after the food poisoning I had no nausea and I was able to keep up with everyone, so despite the low O2 levels, our porters checked themselves and all of us after day 6 on the same monitor, so we know it wasn't misreading. Everyone just kinda shrugged and was like, well, she's still moving. She can't be that bad. After we got to base camp, I realized I couldn't do the 3-day trek back. Was just too depleted. So the next morning the supply helicopter took me to the airport in Lukla, where I caught the normal flight down to Kathmandu, where I was immediately shipped off to the Docs were absolutely shocked at my O2 levels, and turned out I also had a sinus infection on top of the food poisoning and altitude sickness. Told them I was an ultra-marathoner and suddenly it all changed. They were like, oh, that makes sense. Let's just get some fluids in you and keep you for observation. Eat as much as you can from the canteen. Evidently the low and slow training to be utterly miserable for hours on end was able to get my body through this, and honestly, to make me completely unaware of how bad off I was. That sounds badass, but it's not a good thing. Spent the night pigging out on the yummy canteen food and taking the antibiotics for the infection. Felt fine by the next day. The worst part of this whole experience was the fact that I waited for the normal helicopter the next day. If I had been medevaced, my insurance would have covered it, but because I was, God forbid, able to use the cheaper option, it became optional. That was $9,000 I fought with Blue Cross over for years before finally giving up. The hospital itself was only $1,500 and covered aside from my copay. My brother summited Keeley. I told him to bring a GoPro or something, as he probably wouldn't remember being at the top. He snorted at that idea and insisted he'd be fine. Anyway, guess who doesn't remember being at the top? Got lost on the way down, and was so out of it that he was convinced he could take a taxi back to ground level. I find mountaineering so fascinating because that's insane. Why would you do that? Why would you go so high your body starts to fail? Sure, Mount Kilimanjaro doesn't have a peak in the death zone, but still you can get so sick your body starts noping out even while you try and push through. So many extreme sports like mountaineering and cave diving basically amount to, how difficult can I make breathing for fun, and it's wild. Anyway, when I'm done with life I'm going to get one of those insane Mount Everest packages where the Sherpas do all the work for you. Summit. Sit down at the top. Pour bottles of water over myself to take myself out faster, and so I'm good and frozen in place, and I can't just be kicked over the side and ruin everyone's photos forever. My old boss took his 17-year-old son to Africa to summit Kili, and the kid never made it. Altitude sickness got him and he had to turn back. His dad went to the summit without him. Nice guy. Jesus, I can't imagine how brutal 50% levels would have felt. I was in the 70s for about a year due to PTSD, and it felt like I was dying. As much as I love to romanticize mountaineering, this is one of the reasons I'm too scared to get into serious climbing. Mountaineering PPL are insane to me. My asthmatic ass gets out of breath going up 2 flights of steps. God damn. Altitude sickness is a common issue on my Kilimanjaro precisely because it's so easy to climb. I got altitude sickness climbing my Fuji. Also an Aussie who's very used to living at sea level and had no idea what I was in for, cold sweat smile. But because it was a lot harder to climb, my body had more time to acclimate. So it didn't hit me quite as hard as Oop, but it did suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd been feeling fine, and then suddenly I wasn't able to take more than 3 steps without gasping for breath. And every time I stopped, my hiking partner noticed I was swaying on my feet like I was drunk. I'll admit I was even dumber than Oop. I didn't even try calling for aid. I did go back down to a safer height. I just can't understand how a moron that doesn't know how to buy a polar fleece online decided to try and summit Kilimanjaro. Looks like 6 guides per rich idiot was about the right number after all. Op, you need yo thank your guide. He saved your life. Altitude sickness is no joke. I live at over a mile above sea level and still have issues when up in the mountains 20,003,000 feet higher than normal. Then you see lowlanders stumbling around at the ski resorts. I can't imagine trying to get to 19,000 feet, even if you normally lived in Leadville, Colorado, which is 10,000 feet. Okay, what I've learned from this is that I do not understand oxygen levels. Because I thought you were supposed to go to the hospital if it dropped below 95%. And oops, out here with 8,590 as regular? And some of you in the comments had it consistently as low as 60 or 70%. Most unbelievable part of this was the Reddit app working. Oof. That's rough. My own run-in with altitude sickness was much more mild. I moved from essentially sea level to a mile high in the desert and didn't give myself a day to acclimate before starting in on physical tasks. But it's definitely no fun. I can 100% imagine Op thought they were going to die and clutched at any source of info they could find. Kilimanjaro is not that hard of a climb from a technical standpoint. You can essentially hike it. There's no rock climbing or anything. But the altitude sickness is something else. I did it once and never again. I'll never understand why humans have this need to go big mountain. I go uppies. Why?
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.